Good. Well, welcome to ODI Global, and thank you so much for taking the time this evening to join us for this event. It's part of the MDB Leaders series. We are very privileged here at ODI Global to have a chance to welcome MDB leaders, and today is a particularly important moment because we are welcoming my dear friend and former colleague André Küüsvek, who is the president of a Nordic investment bank. André has led NIB for now, I think, 4 years, and has been reappointed as president until August 2029. And there could be no better fitting moment to welcome André, because NIB just celebrated their 50th anniversary. I think it was last week. It was a big celebration in Helsinki. So we are really, really thrilled to have André coming to us at this pivotal moment. We're going to hear André's presenting NIB, what NIB does for those who do not know, but also its strategic orientation. And then André will join me at the panel just to drill down on a couple of aspects. And then we will be joined by a panel discussion where we are going to discuss a very interesting evolution of NIB in financing defense and security, which is something that has been discussed very much, and we think it's appropriate to drill down with other experts and understand what that means and how this is going to work. But meanwhile, André, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frederick, and welcome everybody here. I will say a few words about NIB for background, because it links to some of these key points that I would like to make today, which is Nordic leadership to the world. So I lay out a little bit the landscape as to where are the Nordic countries actually leaders. And then I will, of course, say what I think the challenges are also in the current geopolitical situation that we go through, which then leads to some of these points Frederick already mentioned, that, you know, why is it that we have done what we have done? And why is it that we will do what we need to do? But first, thank you for the reference to the 50 years. It was celebrated in Copenhagen, actually, at the Copenhagen Royal Opera Hall. And the reason for Copenhagen was that NIB was created in 1975. The agreement was signed in Copenhagen. The bank was originally not in the cards, or not being planned by the Nordic countries. They actually wanted to fast forward a single market customs union. The EU didn't even have a single market at the time. Early 70s, oil crisis, big security worries about the neighbor in the east. And the 5 Nordic countries thought, look, also for economic growth, we would like to trade customs free in a single market. The plan was to create something that would have been called Nordic. And the plans were worked on until people in Kremlin, Moscow, Russia, Soviet Union at the time, heard about it. And they called Helsinki. They said, hey, Finland, you were supposed to be our friend. Now you want to gang up with these Western countries? No, we don't think so. So Finland, prime minister level, calls the prime minister of Sweden, says, trouble, we can't join. Swedish prime minister takes a flight, comes over to Helsinki. The 2 men meet, they discuss, they go to the sauna. Those years, most of the big decisions were made in the sauna. Today, only the really difficult ones. And it was then decided that if we can't do a single market customs union, we will create a bank. And it was the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, who later was assassinated, who said, and the bank will be in Helsinki. And it was a political statement at the time to make it visual to everybody that Finland is part of the Nordics. So the bank has always been based in Helsinki, but we celebrated the signing of the agreement in Copenhagen. Now, the Nordic Investment Bank started up with 5 members, Sweden as the largest shareholder, Denmark, Norway, Finland, and then a small Iceland. They agreed from the start they will deploy Nordic diplomacy, one country, one vote. Every country had a board member, and at the shareholders meeting, every country had a veto if they wanted to. I'm not aware of vetoes, though, in the history. The Nordics are very united. And then when the Soviet Union broke apart and the Baltic countries regained their independence, then, of course, the Nordic Investment Bank also started imminently operations in the 3 Baltic countries, started financing, but it took them a long while until they accepted these 3, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, as members. So that, in fact, only happened 2005, after the Baltic countries had already joined EU and NATO. So you see the Nordic bar sometimes for, inviting people to the family is pretty high. So we are now a bank that essentially has its core market, the home market, all the way from the Arctic. The 5 Nordic countries are all Arctic countries as well, members of the Arctic Council, together with Canada, US, and Russia, who is now suspended from the membership. And then through the Nordic countries to the Baltics, but we also have historically financed projects in more than 40 different countries. As long as there is strong member country interest, we can go out, and we have financed in South America, buses in Santiago de Chile, provided by Scania, for instance. We had an office in Singapore way before my time. So the Asian markets, China at the time, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia were pretty big for the NIB. So at the peak, the non-member country financing was actually 20%. Now coming to more to what we do today. We are a mandate-driven bank. We operate commercially, we price commercially, we structure as most other banks would do, private commercial banks or investment banks. But we finance projects that either enhance productivity, i.e. make the countries and the clients and eventually the countries more competitive, or protect the environment, anything that relates to sustainability, climate change, now also increasingly nature. So on these 2 pillars, the bank has been flourishing since about 20 years. And it now, of course, came to the point where it was thought that it's now time to think of how do we preserve the good things we are all creating here. And it was very obvious to me also, 24th of February 2022, that the world is different now. The shareholder meetings, or what is called in the IFI world as the Board of Governors meeting, where all these relevant ministers turn up, is normally not meeting in a physical shape or form. They meet so regularly anyway that there is really no need for the finance ministers to get together specifically for the NIB. And I was the one who then raised the hand and said, now we need to meet, because we need to think, how are we going to act and react differently. So I got them all together in Tallinn early 2024, and we discussed, and we came to a very clear conclusion that security is the precondition for prosperity and sustainability. You cannot have prosperity and sustainability if what you build, what you do, what you create can be taken away by somebody else. Somebody, even one of the ministers at the meeting, said that the ESG, as we know it, environmental, social, and governance issues, of course, if we don't protect it, then it can turn into something that is called economic system for Gosplan. And the Gosplan is the государственное планирование that the Soviet Union did unsuccessfully for about 70 years. So it was very obvious we need to do things differently. We opened up imminently to finance first dual use. We didn't even do that. And then secondly, military and defense, initially excluding the weapons and ammunition. But we agreed on the spot that we will meet again 1 year from now, and then we will think whether we go further. We did. June this year, we met again, and we decided that we need to do what we need to do. So we have now also been financing military and defense, and including now already a first real weapons project in Lithuania, basically ammunition for the artillery. Now, coming to the Nordics, and small countries as they are, between the 8 member countries, they have an aggregate population of about 32 million. It's less than Morocco, less than Poland. Not very big. If you are small, What do you need to do? You need to be smart, you need to be fast. And the Nordic countries have been both, I think. So if you look at where the Nordics rank in terms of the different rankings, and I was going global freedom, not just Europe, global. Finland number 1, Sweden number 2, Norway number 3. Others not very far away. Media freedom, Norway first, Estonia second, Sweden 4th, Finland 5th, Denmark 6th. Personal freedom, Sweden number 1, Denmark number 3, Finland number 4, Estonia number 5. PISA scores, education, which is the kind of the foundation really to create a society that can do the right thing. The top 6 are all Asian. And then number 7, Estonia, Finland immediately thereafter. Global innovation scores, Sweden second, the other 2 countries, Finland, Denmark, also in the top 10. Global competitiveness, Denmark, Sweden, again, very high up in the top 8. Credit ratings, we have Moody's here. You know, how many countries still have a AAA rating globally? 9. 3 of them are in the Nordics, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. If you look at the MDB or IFI universe, then NIB has the strongest shareholders. 77% of the capital provided of the shareholding is by AAA countries, and the rest is not far behind. Happiness ranking, we need to talk about that too, especially now that it is kind of dark and damp in Helsinki. Finland number 1, Denmark number 2, Iceland number 3, Sweden number 4, Norway 7th. So, you know, again, very high up. Gender equality, Iceland dominant number 1, Finland number 2, Norway number 3. So whatever rankings that matter for kind of these core values, you will always see the Nordics and now also increasingly the Baltic countries at the very top. Digitalization or whatever way we might look at it. So what has triggered that success? I think first being smart and being fast, also being pragmatic. When we talk about defense, for instance, in Finland there has been a law since early 70s. Whenever you build an office building, whenever you build an apartment block, you have to build a bomb shelter. They were not even NATO members until the full-scale war by Russia to Ukraine. So they have been preparing. They have more artillery than Germany and France taken together, Finland alone. So they are pretty well prepared. They are absolute net positive to NATO. And I was there, of course, in 2022. As I said, 24th of February changed it all. Up to that point, Finland was always thinking, you know, we're a little bit in a country in between. We need to get along with both neighbors. And even you know, they always kind of aligned all their big political decisions with Sweden historically for 700 years. Then this was the first time in 700 years that Finland didn't call Sweden saying, we have an idea, we need to talk to you about it. Finland called Sweden and says, we are going to NATO. We are going now, are you coming? And they got there before Sweden because of you remember, Erdogan tried to trade with Sweden, and that took a while. So my point is the Nordic leadership really is based on values. It is always based on pragmatic and then the order-based system. If you are looking for one country in Europe that is the most law-obeying, it's Finland. It's in their blood. There has been, by the way, a test where globally in the countries, they dropped 200 wallets with some money in it and then a business card or something. And then they counted how many wallets came back. Finland won. So the war in Ukraine was not only a worry about Ukraine and Europe. It was not even only about countries' own security. It was actually a violation of a core value. And that's even bigger. It was a violation of the order-based society and the world. So based on that, in my mind, if we looked at the challenges 5 years ago, then I would have said for the Nordic and Baltic countries, there are 3 Ds that are the key challenges. Demographics, aging population, decarbonization, the climate issue, and then finally digitalization, where the countries have actually done pretty well, but there is a lot more to do. Now, as of today, I say we have moved from the 3D world to the 5D world. So the first 3Ds are still very much relevant, but then now we also have deglobalization, and we see it. Our friends and allies on the other side of the Atlantic are becoming, should I say, somewhat unpredictable. You don't know what you wake up to, what sort of news, and who gets what tariff in the morning. And then the second and the final 5D is defense. And as I said, I think it's now a precondition to anything war, anything else. Now, coming back and maybe wrapping up here, the NIB role, I think, is bigger than it used to be. And I think so is the role of the other MDBs. Today is the time to think differently, to act. And I also think that we might actually be at the start of the biggest investment cycle in the history. There is a lot of liquidity. The liquidity, for most part, is not sitting where it maybe need to sit, even for the return part. You know, much of the pension fund money is still invested in where the inflation eats up, if not all, then a big chunk of it. So that's one. And then secondly, of course, as I said, each of the three big Ds needs a lot of investment. Big numbers. We have seen that certain investment decisions by private sector companies have been postponed for reasons both east and, as I said, the other side of the Atlantic. But I think the private sector will continue to be the engine of the growth, and very, very much understand it as a relatively small MDB. We have a balance sheet of 45 billion euros, which is probably about a little bit more than a half of EBRD's balance sheet today. We are focused mostly in the member countries, but our non-member country lending still exists. Poland is pretty big, as are a few of the other countries. And then I think also the success will hang on the partnerships. So between what MDBs do and how they mobilize private sector, it's also how the MDBs and IFIs themselves are cooperating. And we certainly contribute our part to it. And then finally, how some of that kind of politically driven money, European Commission, etc., the Invest EU program, how that money is also being channeled and used. So perhaps I would stop here. Just to summarize, the NIB was there for one reason, Nordic unity, then it was there for the competitiveness, then it opened up for environment, and now we are doing defense to protect it all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, André. Please. Thank you very much. And it's wonderful to hear behind a bank, there are really a set of value and people and vision, because ultimately that's what organizations are. We're going to come and discuss defense in a few minutes, but I'd like to drill down a little bit on some of the operation of NIB. And you mentioned that ambition, appetite for investment, and you mentioned nature, and that's something that we see across the MDB, the focus not just on climate adaptation and mitigation, but also incorporating nature and biodiversity considerations. Can you tell us a little bit more where NIB stands on this?
I guess we are still at the fairly at the start of the process. We have a climate strategy. We were considering whether to have a nature strategy. We decided not to. We think the two, climate and nature, they are part of the same thing, more or less. One is this big global issue, and then of course nature is also global, but it's also a lot more local. Helsinki is maybe the one place where part of the happiness, I think, can be related to the fact that you can be in the city center, and then it's 15-20 minutes drive, and you are in the nature, forest, sea. So the values in the Nordics, they very much include the nature. And of course, it also relates to the Arctic region. If we talk about now, potentially a melting of the perma ice, then it is something which will change many lives. So we are thinking to, within the review of the climate strategy now, to combine the nature into it is the answer.
Excellent. We will be looking at that with great interest. And then you talk about partnership, mobilizing private capital. You have a very established program of bond issuance, green bond, blue bonds issuance. But are you also looking at the development in other MDBs and DFI about originating assets and sharing the assets, sharing the risk, or even distributing? You've seen, of course, the transaction the IFC did 8 weeks ago. Is that something that NIB is looking?
We do. We think about it for several different reasons. First of all, when I joined the bank early 2021, we actually had an economic capital constraint. We are one of the only, perhaps only, or very, very few globally of the development banks that actually pays dividends. So we have been returning the capital to our Nordic countries. When we close this year and get to New Year and we pay out the dividend within our dividend policy, which is very likely to be the case, then the Nordic countries have got their money back 5 times. Cash to cash, of course, 50 years is a long term. But even within that time frame, if you look at the return, then the internal rate of return is 10%, give and take. So that's not a bad investment. Now, coming to your point, how do we mobilize? And the reason I was also talking about dividends is sometimes when we get the new board member, then the first board meeting, the new board member tells me, "But you're a taxpayer-funded bank," and I'm saying, technically we're not. We have the equity, and we have been regenerating that equity, of course, accumulating retained earnings, and we've been paying out dividends, but we are really funded by the capital markets. So you mentioned the bonds, the greens and the blues. We are now issuing also. We were the very first sovereign supranational, so of any government / any IFI MDB that issued the SLLB, Sustainability Linked Loan Bond. Nobody had done it. We did it this year. But I think if we talk about mobilization, well, then, of course, we first start on the asset side. So we have limited ourselves to 50% of any project. So also on the financing side, when we come in, we never finance more than 50. And if we can, we scale back and do less just to get the projects off the ground. And then we mobilize private sector through our bond issuance, which basically beefs up the balance sheet and provides the liquidity. About 2/3 of our total investor base is actually private sector, mostly big pension funds, asset managers, and then bank treasuries. And about 1/3 is central banks, which is kind of public money, if you want. And then when we talk about are we generating to distribute, was that the word, or was it something similar? Originate to distribute. So we have been traditionally originating to hold. We have, since my joining the bank, we have been originating to distribute risk. And we have done it in 2 different ways. One is the Invest EU that I mentioned, for instance, where for the new project, we get the first loss portfolio-based guarantee from the European Commission. And this is thanks to the fact that the Commission decided to go for what is called open architecture. It was earlier only available to the European Investment Bank and its group, including the European Investment Fund. Now a quarter of that money is available to everybody else. And everybody else includes EBRDs and the Council of Europe Development Bank and NIB, but also all the national development banks that have been through the so-called pillar assessment and have been considered good. So we were one of the first to go for it. I was actually I had a bit of a pushback within the institution. They said, "Oh, European Union, sounds like very bureaucratic." And I said, I allow you to tell me that once you have tried. We tried. We have been able to actually rationalize. We have made proposals to the Invest EU Credit Committee. They have taken our much easier templates. Everybody now should do that. So we have actually been able to even influence with our small size. And then the other way we have been originating to distribute risk is that because of those economic capital constraints, we also then started to do credit insurance. And we applied that on individual single loans, and mostly on those where we had a very high concentration risk. For instance, industry in Sweden, for instance, energy in Norway, just to make sure that because the economic capital is eaten up also by several aspects, concentration is one of them. So we got a little bit of that off. Now, having said that, we have not done what IFC has done or what the African Development Bank has done, basically securitizing out, which would be the one to distribute really. We're not excluding it. Now, there is a bit of a nuance. Our portfolio is in too good of a shape. 90% of our counterparts are actually investment grade or the equivalents. So when we sell it to somebody else, or even when we buy credit insurance, we play on the difference of what the insurance company's rating is versus what the counterparty rating is in our portfolio. And this difference is much smaller in case of NIB than it will be in other banks. So we are not releasing that much capital, which is both fortunate and unfortunate. But I wouldn't exclude it in the future. We'll see.
Sure. Excellent. Lovely. Thank you very much for all these insights on the NIB. And now I'd like to move to the panel discussions. I will call panelists joining. Rebecca Harding on my right. So Rebecca is the CEO of a Center for Economic Security and a leading authority on international trade economics. She's also a director of Sovereign Resilience Finance and serves as a strategic advisor roles. And she is in particular the Chief Economic Advisor to the Defense, Security and Resilience Bank Development Group. Thank you very much for joining us, Rebecca. And then to my left is Dorota Meredith, my colleague. Dora is the director of ODI Europe since November 2022, and she's had a very impressive career before, head of program at the Institute for the Future of Works and elsewhere. Thank you very much, Dora, for coming from Brussels to take part to this panel. So we'll get going. First question, André, is walk us. Yes, of course, but let me start with you, and then I'll move to a panelist. I would like you to walk us through that change of policy you mentioned, the two-step change in policy to allow financing first security related and then even military equipment. What was the consideration that played into the discussion? And importantly, are there any railguards associated with this policy?
Well, I said a few words about it in my opening remarks, that we saw it as a necessity, really. But the process, from my point of view, of course, I need to manage my stakeholders, shareholders, board members, etc. Getting them together was one starting point. Then, of course, the Nordic countries are, in their own ways, quite careful, also in terms of how much they want to be on the front line as small countries. But I would say we basically took the whole potential financing or not of this defense sector. We put it into 5 different categories. The number one where we were doing nothing. Number 2 was dual use and only dual use. Number 3 was basically to do military and defense, but without weapons and ammunition. Number 4 is including weapons and ammunition, the conventional weapons and ammunition. And then number 5 is the controversial stuff, including all the conventions on landmines, Ottawa Convention, and chemical weapons and these type of things. Never mind the nuclear. And we basically had these 8 ministers in the room, and we were moving that needle and saying, look, where do you think we should be? And it was quite an achievement, actually, to get to the point in one meeting where they say, we need to do it. And then since the ministers agreed, then the next board meeting that followed, these board members nominated by their relevant ministers, they made a decision. Some of them had to consult also on the details with the capitals, some of them perhaps less so, but we got there. And then we also put a mark to 12 months forward. We meet again, we talk again. And the second decision was actually easier. It was relatively easy to then say, fine, we do what needs to be done. We now also open up for weapons.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, let me turn to Rebecca now. So Rebecca, you are currently acting as the Chief Economic Advisor for the Defense, Resilience and Security Bank, which is this multinational financial institution, which is in the process of being created. So I appreciate you can't say too specifics. A lot of things are still under wrap. But can you tell us more, both on the why? Why do we need such institution? And the what? What could it potentially consist of, and how would it work?
So thank you very much for the invitation. Absolutely delighted to be here. I'm an economist, and I've just written a book actually called The World Economic War. And in that book, I argue that one of the reasons why we're in this situation is because we haven't been prepared enough with our own financial levers to address the very large security challenges that actually Europe's been facing for a long time. It's not just something that's happening now, and a lot of those threats are actually economic ones. You look at how we are being undermined and how our economy has been undermined, not just since 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine and oil prices shot up and food prices shot up, but also earlier than that. You look at the influence over international trade, you look at trade, you referred to trade wars between China and the United States, all this kind of dissatisfaction with the multilateral rules-based order and the fragmentation of our institutional structures, including multilateral development banks and the World Trade Organization, has been happening for a long time. So when I was offered the chance to start to work on something that actually used financial levers to create a transition from where we are at the moment to where we need to be in 3 or 4 years' time, that was my decision to do it, to provide that support. Why? First off, like multilateral banks around the world, this provides an opportunity for some of the poorer nations. And so the Nordics can shut their ears at the moment because they're all AAA rated. But for some of the poorer nations in Europe, there's a very serious kinetic crisis, military crisis on their doorstep. And that means that they have to scale up defense spending very, very quickly. Now, if you just scale up defense spending, you will create inflation, economics 101, because you're sucking in imports, you're creating shortages and supply chain blockages. So if you just scale up the amount of money as a government that you're spending, you might have a very short-term effect on economic growth for like 2 to 3 years. And there's a lot of work done on this. 1% on defense means 1% on GDP, etc. We all know the numbers. But the key thing that a multilateral bank can do that no other institution can do, and I'm telling everyone their own jobs here, but it's actually get that money down to the bits of the supply chain that actually need it. So the growth effects, so what I've done is actually look at the growth effects of defense spending and then look at the growth effects that are there from the multilateral financial structures that are out there. And because those multilateral financial structures can fund stuff through guarantees, through co-investments, through different types of financial instruments, project finance, trade finance, etc., it means that the money can go straight to the supply side, which needs to adjust very quickly. So quite apart from being able to borrow more cheaply at AAA credit, this is actually something that's a lot more sophisticated than that. It's allowing the supply side in Europe to adjust very, very quickly. And it's not just in things that go bang, you know, it's not just the ammunitions, it's also in the digital infrastructures, it's in the security and communications frameworks that we have. I had a statistic given to me which absolutely horrified me. China has put up into the sky something in the region of 2,500 satellites in the last 18 months. Russia has put up something in the region of 1,500. The United States has put up something in the region of 800. How many has Europe put up, including the UK? 2. So we have a really serious problem here. Our supply side needs to adjust. What we've learned from Ukraine is that we need to have flexible financial instruments and the capacity to be able to create flexible architectures for buying this stuff. It's only by having a multilateral structure like this that you can build the infrastructures to do that. And the other thing that I'm doing, which is the Security and Resilience Fund, is actually a private credit fund, a bank fund that de-risks bank funding, because banks themselves at a non-multilateral level find it very difficult to fund this stuff because of ESG requirements and so on. And more banks are beginning to say, yeah, it's actually okay as long as we don't fund cluster munitions or landmines or nuclear weapons, the controversial stuff, which should be funded by governments anyway, that where it's appropriate. Anything that's banned under an international treaty, we won't fund. Anything that's controversial, we won't fund. But everything else actually comes into the category of we need to fund that on security. And I'll just finish with one point. ESG, environment, social and governance, you called it economic security for Gosplan. The word that I am now getting from banks is energy, security and guns. And that is the way in which the banking sector is going. They need to de-risk some of that reputationally and in terms of performance. So a multilateral bank structure, development bank structure, that's exactly what a multilateral development bank does. So there you go.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I'll come back to you to drill down more on this supply chain in a minute. But I would like to turn to Dora. Dora, ODI Europe has a key strategic pillar, securing the future. And that is to say, bridging the divide between defense, security, climate, development. We touched on that already, and also humanitarian policy. So tell us more and how you see the current context playing out in Europe.
Great. Thank you so much, Frederique. And it's really an honor to join such a distinguished panel and to hear you both. So thank you so much. Let me focus on Europe at the kind of high level political level, and also, as you say, the program that we have in ODI Europe, which is really looking at how do you bridge some of these different areas. Well, first, as I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone in this room, security is absolutely one of the dominant political agendas across Europe at the moment. The war in Ukraine has exposed critical weakness in the defence capacity and resilience, and it's really triggered this scramble across different member states, even those with strong neutrality positions. And I think that is important for us to be remembering when we're thinking about the Union and the different positions across the states. To be really making a change in their financing approaches. So, for example, Austria plans to double its defence budget share by 2032. Cyprus aims to reach 2% by 2028, and states like Sweden, Finland, Denmark, as we've heard, are heading towards 2.5 by 2030. The exact same thing is happening in the discussions around the MFF, which is a multi-annual financial framework, the EU's big long-term budget, which is currently being negotiated. The earmarked defence and security spending is rising from 47.4 billion in the last MFF, so 47 billion, to 234 billion in the proposal currently put forward by the Commission. That's almost a 5-fold increase. So really think about that amount of money. And as a share of the MFF, it's jumping from 4.4% to nearly 13%. So a profound shift in Europe's strategic posture. But this also does imply trade-offs, because you look, for example, at the spending on social objectives, and that's actually falling from 11% to 7%. So perhaps that's also something to consider in terms of the politics around some of these decisions. The work that we're doing, as you say, Frederique, is particularly looking at how do you bridge the divides between these often siloed policy areas. And we argue that we need a much more integrated concept to security. And that's exactly what the EU's strategic compass, which is its kind of long-term foreign policy agenda, calls for. And yet in practice, it's often risking adopting quite a narrow definition of security. And actually, as we've shown in our recent report, The Case for Development in 2025, the symbiotic relationship between defence and development is often missing. And we see political narratives actually pitching aid versus defence instead of seeing them as mutually reinforcing. ODI Global's research, and I know there's some colleagues in the room who worked on this, actually shows that countries meeting defence spending targets sometimes are less likely to meet their aid targets, just when global fragility is rising. So we really see these things as very much linked. So if member states are now to be increasing their financing, we think it's crucial that development actors are around the table. And we see this already starting to happen. For example, with Germany, they've now announced their new National Security Council, and BMZ are sat on that council, which is great to see. We'd like to see that rolled out more across Europe. And of course, as we've heard, this has clear implications for MDBs. This means that, you know, we need to make sure that this approach to resilience, climate development is brought into security investments, and that is a deeper and more deliberate approach. We also think, as we've heard, we need to use the MDB system more strategically as a way that we can be mobilizing the private capital at scale in some of these urgent needs. And finally, we think, you know, there are opportunities to be thinking about the metrics that we're using around some of these investments. How do we make sure that we're bringing together both security objectives, but also thinking about some of the other objectives that have long been held by the MDB system? Final point, I think it was made earlier about the need for new partnerships with these new objectives. And indeed, we think only by working together as a kind of ecosystem can we be bringing together these often siloed policy areas together. And that's an approach that we should do. Happy to say that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dora. And I would like to react to the point you made about the need to integrate development and defense and security in a coherent. So,
can I reflect?
Please,
on
absolutely,
this financing aspect,
yes.
particularly because you mentioned the percentages of GDP that, of course, go up virtually everywhere in Europe and potentially elsewhere. And Poland and Estonia, for instance, next year, they are both going to spend more than 5% of GDP. Now, there are two aspects here. One is, of course, because what happens in the market economy, when the demand increases, the prices go up, right? So sometimes you need to also think about the fact that even you are not spending twice as much as a percentage of GDP. Frankly, you still get the same amount of stuff. So that's one of these dilemmas that we are facing, because everybody wants to buy at the same time. And then the other thing is, which comes from Rebecca earlier, what she said is, you know, how do we finance it? And we certainly apply still the same basic criteria of bankability. You can't do things different. You just have to apply the same. You need to look at, okay, you know, what's the completion risk? Where is the offtake? You know, what sort of licenses, environmental aspects you need to gather. You know, how strong is the borrower, cash flow wise, equity wise, and so on. And the reality is that it's a difficult sector to finance, because if you finance a power plant, you rest assured, you know, even if the offtake is only for 20 years, 40 years later, it still generates electricity that somebody needs it. Now, with the weapons, you really don't know. You don't even know for kind of a 10-year plus, because many of the governments operate, we have this year's budget, then we have an idea about next year's budget, and then we have this budget planning, depending on the country, 3 to 5 years, but no commitment. So really, really hard. And then once you manage it all, you produce the weapons, they get financed. Hopefully much of it goes for export that will then also boost the economic growth eventually in these countries. But then again, there are, you know, restrictions as to what can happen to them. We finance them, these weapons and ammunition, hoping they will never be used. If they never get used, what happens to them in the end? You dispose of it or you sell it to somebody else? Difficult patch.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, André. That's exactly what I wanted to ask. How will you in NIB measure the success of that policy? Do you have KPI? Do you have a target?
We're not a kind of a program-based bank, really. We are way behind the World Bank and many others that do the programming much better than we do. We act on demand. This year, 8th of May, Finance Minister of Lithuania calls me and says, look, we want to send you a letter today. We need 400 million. That was 8th of May. 20th of May, we signed the loan agreement. So we act fast. We don't have a specific target, and rest assured, the productivity mandate and the sustainability or environmental mandate, they will continue to represent the core part of our business for a foreseeable future. So we are talking about relatively small portion. The only KPI, which is not a target, it's rather measuring. We actually measure, how much we do in dual use, how much we do in defense. And then perhaps we also measure the things we can't do in these sectors.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Rebecca, I'd like to come back to you. You mentioned beyond the political commitment, the implementation and the economic spillover that such policy financing defense can bring. Can you walk us through the supply chain issues, the procurement, the infrastructure that's needed, just to explain us a little bit more how you see that economic transformation taking place?
So, we've already heard that the issue is that some of these defence companies are actually intuitively difficult to fund. Why are they difficult to fund? Because they don't have the long-term contracts. They have what's called in banking future receivables. And future receivables has a very bad reputation because we don't know whether or not those receivables, the contract is actually going to land. The smaller companies in those supply chains are very, very vulnerable because they spend a lot of time getting themselves onboarded with governments. They spend a lot of time getting themselves onboarded with the prime companies that sit at the top of those supply chains. So from a banking point of view, from the ordinary bank sitting on a high street's point of view, they say, it's very difficult to fund those organisations because they haven't got a strong balance sheet, they haven't got secure contracts. They might, but their real scalability depends on there being something really rather unpleasant happening in the world that doesn't align with our social values. And so we actually prefer not to do all of that. Now, what's changing is that governments are beginning to work with those financial institutions to say, we'll give you a security wraparound. So we will use things like the KfW in Germany, or the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau, the Reconstruction Bank. We'll use organisations like yours. We'll use sovereign guarantee funds as well, like UK Export Finance, in order to be able to provide security guarantees for those types of organisations that need to be able to do this. But the problem is it's too little too late. We need the institutional structures now in order to be able to create that growth. And I'll give you an example. We've been speaking in the Security and Resilience Fund to an organisation that funds soundproofing, that builds soundproofing. And it builds soundproofing for helicopters. And those helicopters, Apache helicopters and so on, they can't fly without the soundproofing because the people who are flying the helicopters can't hear, etc. It's a health and safety thing. So they are producing a dual-use good, actually, because the helicopter could be for civilian purposes or it could be for military purposes. But they have spent a long time onboarding themselves because this particular soundproofing can also be used in nuclear submarines. So they've spent a long time onboarding themselves with the UK government and with a prime. And the prime has gone, we won't let you have a contract with us. We've got this deal with the government. You've been onboarded by the government. We won't let you have a deal with us until you've got the money. And the bank are going, but we won't let you have the money until you've got the deal done and over the line with the prime. And there's this kind of circular argument. Now that contract is investable. That contract can be funded, and that's what a multilateral bank will do. But it's also what a private credit fund focused on this sort of supply chain thing will do. That's how you get the innovation. That's how you get the SMEs with deep pockets. That's how you create jobs. And back to the ESG thing, if you've got an organization multilaterally that is dedicated to defence, security and resilience, then the other organisations like the EBRD, like the Asian Development Bank, etc., can carry on with their mandate, because effectively what you've done is create, in every sense of the word, except the financial one, a bad bank, a bank that does nasty things. That actually means that some of these things can be ring-fenced, and we don't have so many of those trade-offs. But then one last example. We've got another project in our pipeline at the moment that is actually for Ukrainian satellites. Okay, so it's an international project. It's a Czech consortium. They want to be able to supply satellites into Ukraine. So they're looking for money to do all of this. First use case is defence. Obviously, it's communications on the battlefield. So a lot of organisations run a mile because it's defence. But if we can prevent war, then actually those satellites have a very good system for monitoring climate change, for monitoring crop growth, for monitoring disease resistance, etc., etc. And so they become food and energy security as well. And after the conflict, or while we are building new infrastructures in Ukraine, that's something that can be used for civilian purposes as well, but it can't get money at the moment. And that's how you create this sort of innovation base that has the mindset of needing to do something for security and resilience in it, but that can actually, over a longer period of time, help to do good as well.
Thank you. André?
It resonates a big time, what you say in my head. I mean, you have these very big defense companies, right? BAE Systems, etc. In the Nordics, you know, Patria, Saab, Kongsberg, and they're okay, more or less, right? They can find financing. They can go to the capital market. But then there is this whole supply chain of medium-sized small companies which have a deep trouble. They can't scale up quickly enough because they're not bankable. You know, our first defense loan was actually to a communications company, Savox, in Finland. We need just 5 million. And they say that 5 million enables us to do a lot of R&D. They are very R&D intensive, pretty much all of those companies. Saab, that produces the Griffin fighter jets, their R&D intensity is 17% of their total turnover. And in most countries, we are talking about, let's create a 2% club of companies that, you know, spend minimum 2%. They do 17. So, you know, there is a massive amount that needs to go in without knowing, does it actually produce something? And there is I also agree that there is a very strong link between defense industry, space industry, and then other civil industries where, you know, some of these innovations can be used over time.
Can I just add one other thing, which is this? You've quite rightly, Dora, pointed out the fact that governments are spending huge amounts of money. The figure that I heard yesterday was across Europe, it's 3.2 trillion euros is going into some form of defence spending at the moment. Now, a lot of that money is going into the primes. So it's going into the BAE Systems, it's going into the Rheinmetalls, etc., etc. It's going in at the top. And they're just going, right, fine, give us money, we'll sort out the problem. But what they do is they arbitrage. So they go through their financials, they go through their supply chains and they go, right, okay, so we've got a project here, and how are we going to service that project? Well, we're going to go through all of our supply chain, we're going to work out who can do it most cost effectively, and we're going to top slice the top. Now, with a multilateral development bank and trade finance systems, they can actually go through, you can get the money to the right parts of the supply chain just in time, right? At the right time in the right place. And so it takes out some of that factor, which is creating supply chain irresilience, if there is a word, because what's happening at the moment is the money is going in at the top and taking 2 or 3 years to get down. So I mean, Saab Saab itself would say that some of its supply chains are taking 7 years to deliver shoulder-launched rocket missiles. 7 years. Why? It doesn't. They're relatively small, and that's no good if you're on the front line in Ukraine. So we have to think about how to stop that process of arbitrage without undermining this fantastic work that the primes do as well. So it's a special case. This industry is a special case.
So I think, some of the public money would need to come into financing the whole value chain. And I think it's better spent if it comes in as guarantee. And then the governments take comfort from the banks, not just the IFIs, MDBs, but also private banks, because these people know how things get financed, how to structure, and maybe what are the ones we shouldn't finance. So, and it saves a lot of public money eventually.
Great. Look, I can see that the discussion could go on. Dora, before we close the panel, I just wanted to come back to you about where the European Union is at the moment. And certainly because of a time when I was born and the way I perceive the European Union was first and foremost a project of peace. And now it looks like it becomes a project of war. So is that completely changed? What's your take from Brussels?
No, I think it's not completely changed, but I do think it's evolving. I think for me, the EU's kind of founding idea, as you say, is very much about how economic ties can create this sort of stabilizing force. And as we've kind of talked about, the links with competitiveness, security, and broader policies are, sort of more interconnected than ever. So I think for me, it's also kind of how does Europe build off that to a broader set of partners, and how does it use its economic partnerships to also enable broader security objectives? Now, you see that, of course, with the enlargement agenda, where, it is fundamentally not just about economic objectives, but also about peace. And I think that's been one of the EU's most effective tools in trying to stabilize the neighborhood and build kind of shared rules and mutual prosperity. But this logic, I think, increasingly is being looked at beyond the neighborhood. And we're seeing now, a real push in terms of partnerships in the coming years from the EU, both in terms of security and economic ambitions. And, at the moment, for example, the EU-India partnership, which is being negotiated, has both an economic focus, but also a security focus. But we could see that increasingly happening with other middle powers and regional hubs, the likes of South Africa, Turkey, Indonesia, Vietnam, Brazil. I think here, there is also the importance of supply chains, which we've been talking about, whether it's critical raw materials or hydrogen, but also seeing that as a way that you can build a closer relationship with countries that can also be used for your security interests as well. And that, as I sort of mentioned, is very much part of our work in thinking about how does Europe navigate this new global context? How does it bring together some of its economic interests, but also the security interests? And where possible, try to think about both of those things together.
Excellent. I think we're gonna bring the panel to a close, but open it now for Q&A. We have about 10 minutes, so there is question online, but if you have a question or comment, please. Yes. We'll take a few and then we'll go online as well.
Thank you. My name is Mark Boland, so I'm originally from Sweden, so I know of the Nordic investment banks. My question is how do you define like the interest or sort of target is kind of something to invest in stuff or support economic activity with some kind of Nordic interest? I mean, how do you fit in, combine with the national development banks and maybe also the export credit agencies that also kind of finance things like you mentioned, Scania truck deal in Chile. and how do you do that? Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Or, I mean, I guess you also work together with these, but is there any kind of defining line? I guess nature and defense is kind of easy to see the collective interest, but how do you do it otherwise? Thank you.
Let's take all questions. Yeah, Jessica.
So my question is related to the fiscal multipliers that you talked about. I'm just curious about how you would think of NATO and the new target in terms of these fiscal multipliers and also I suppose how countries would be able to sort of contribute to that target or demonstrate that they're contributing to that target by effectively investing in multilateral institutions. Are they able to do that? Or does that count as like separate to the 5%?
Thank you. Questions? Yeah, Rebecca.
Hi, thank you very much for that really interesting discussion. Two questions. One, we've not talked too much about sort of biotech, so I'm thinking more on the sort of dual use side, perhaps on like synthetic bloods and stuff. Would that type of investment come in that, so the sort of the medical side of the military, also agriculture, but specifically the military? And then I think one point I think Rebecca you focused on is the time it's taking to get this finance on board, because if you think about the battle space and the evolutions within that, as you rightly say, to get an RPG into theatre, you can't be taking 7 years, but also the military itself, thinking of some of the procurement challenges that have like Ajax tank, for example. How can perhaps the finance and the military procurement processes work a little bit, well, not a little bit, a lot better, so that we're not, the risk isn't there of having these kind of redundancies, and then the applications, the weapon systems not being fit for purpose when it gets to theatre.
Great. More questions? Yeah, Philip.
Thank you. My question is more about banking. All the MDBs are under tremendous pressure from the G20 to do more with the capital they have. And I was wondering whether the Nordic Investment Bank was under a similar challenge to do more with their capital.
Thank you. And there is a question for you, André, online, and how NIB stands out for potential client, and in particular, why would a client go to NIB and not go to EBRD, a potential competitor? So if you want to elaborate on that. André, do you want to start? Rebecca, I think there was a couple of questions for you, and feel free as well to comment on any questions.
So maybe let me start from the online then. How does NIB stand out? I mean, first of all, we don't want to in any way be monopoly. As I said, we have this 50% threshold anyway, so we need somebody with private sector, hopefully, if not private sector, somebody else. Today, I referred the project to EBRD. Last week, I referred the project to EIB. We can do so many things together, and that's perfectly okay. We don't want to, I mean, we don't have a volume target per se, let's put it this way. Mark asked the question on how do we define the Nordic or Baltic interest in a project, and I understood that was more generic. So it's not defense sector specific. So it basically would need to be mandate compliant. So it would need to be something that either improves the productivity or protects the environment. Productivity, of course, also in the countries that are our members export is, you know, a very positive. So if there is export, if there is ownership, you know, I give you one example, Ericsson, providing telecom equipment. So they've been investing globally since, you know, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, now developing 6G networks. We have given Ericsson itself 18 loans. We have also given 18 loans, and that's a coincidence that there's a same number, to their clients elsewhere, you know, Malaysian telecom and so on, because we think it's good if we can build global champions in our small countries. And in the telecom sector, of course, Nokia and Ericsson are two of the three global champions now. But there are others, you know, Volvo, Scania, Electrolux, Assa Abloy, you name. There are many, many big names that are household names. Or I try also on, was it Rebecca that asked the question? Yeah, medical and agri side. I mean, for us, this is part of the same resilience. So we have actually been financing resilience projects since a long time. You know, water supply, food security, telecommunications, these type of things, you know, undersea cables and so on, some of which are now in the hybrid war being cut by shadow fleet of Russia on the flags that countries that are difficult to find on the map. So for us, it's part of the same thing. So it doesn't always need to be weapon. And I just to say, maybe on the defense side, that we are financing weapons not to have a great war. We are financing weapons to preserve the peace. Very important. But I maybe, and then I can go, Philip also asked the question on the G20, whether we have had pressure. The answer is no. It's the first time now that a representative of the Nordic countries has been invited to the G20 meetings. They've never been G20, they have been G60 and plus. Now they're there. I mean, President Alexander Stubb is now at the big tables for obvious reasons. Denmark had the EU presidency this year. Now has been invited as, but it's normally one country. So there has been no pressure, but we have been part of these MDB working groups as one of the 14 members, where, you know, if the chief risk officers get together, the chief financial officers get together, the secretary generals get together, we are represented in those. We know of these pressures, we know of the technicalities, we take into account, consider, analyze, but we really haven't had a need to jump and suddenly do a lot more. I think we're doing good business as much as we can.
Great. Rebecca.
So some technical questions for me. The NATO 5%, the answer is yes, it helps. Because for countries which are struggling to hit that 5% target, there is a framework whereby the countries can actually borrow at reduced at a preferential rate in order to be able to fund their 5%. Now, obviously, that depends on where the payable, how much callable capital there is, how much has been possible to raise. But the idea is that you create a AAA credit rated organization that can then that has callable capital if necessary, that it acts as an off-balance sheet mechanism for funding security and defense, and then it becomes a mechanism for a country that can't afford to get to 5% to borrow as well. Now, the most important thing, I think, in terms of the multipliers and long-term economic growth is actually the 1.5%. And that's what we're about here. That's what the supply chain side is all about. It's about enabling that 1.5% that governments have to spend to have a positive impact on growth, because that's the challenge. All of Europe has exactly the same growth challenge at the moment, which is that its supply side can't adjust quickly enough. We've talked a lot about that. It's not able to grow quickly enough in order to be able to scale up quickly enough and in order to prevent the inflationary problems that André talked about. So the problem that we have is that 1.5% has to lead through to economic growth. It can't do anything else. Now, if we can get money to the right bits of the supply chain, and if we can start this process of enabling adjustment, transition, you know, from automotives into military production, etc., then we're in a better position to be able to create that type of economic growth. So it hits both of those. And then Rebecca asked a technical question around, it's actually flexibility and speed, because one of the things that we've learned from Ukraine is that you can't necessarily fight a conflict these days with huge infrastructure. You have to have huge infrastructure. You need the air defense systems, you need you know, the big tanks, etc. But the thing that Ukraine has taught us is that flexibility, that redundancy, actually we can't fund redundancy. We've got to get money to the front line very, very quickly. Now, I happen to know that there are changes in the way governments are beginning to think about procurement so that it gets more flexible as time goes by. The problem with procurement at the moment is that it's been a government prime relationship. And so because it's a government prime relationship, it actually creates that rigidity in financing. One of the things that I and a number of other people have been banging on about for the last couple of years is if you can start to look at managing the money through the prime, but taking it down to the right bits of the supply chain, you take out that lack of flexibility. So you're not building as much redundancy into the system. I mean, ultimately, the soldier on the front line in theatre actually has a credit card to buy what they want in Ukraine. That's not something that a multilateral bank is necessarily going to be able to address, nor is it something that a private credit fund enabling short or medium term working capital into this type of framework is going to be able to do. But particularly what a working capital framework and a trade finance framework can do, working with other multilateral banks, is create that flexibility, short-term finance, which liquidates very quickly, where the producer, the SME, producing a drone, actually, or something like equivalent, can actually get deep pockets very, very quickly. Because the problem is that government departments say, we will work with SMEs, but we will only work with SMEs that have deep pockets, which means you go to Palantir and Helsing. I mean, you know, and that means that you're not investing in your industrial base, which is where we start to get all the growth dividends. So what we have to do is say, okay, we need to use that working capital, that trade finance, that supply chain finance mechanism, because that will then have positive effects on redundancy as well. And it's using what the receivable, it's using the contract or the future contract in order to be able to raise money. And the government needs to put guarantees and wrappers around all of that. But that's the off-balance sheet. That's the off-balance sheet lending that we've talked about, the guarantee systems and so on.
And the Chinese have just put in 48 billion into a similar fund.
They have.
Let's continue the discussion over drinks. But before we close, I'd like really quickly to all my distinguished panelists to put forward a question that came online by one of our colleagues, Nilima Gujjarani. It's a bit of a concern that is it a European concern, this territorial insecurity, or are we running the risk, as some countries have expressed the concern, especially at the UN General Assembly this year, that we are going to fuel a legacy of conflict and insecurity elsewhere, another global arms race? Do you think it's a worry? In 30 seconds, each of you, starting with Dora. 30 seconds.
I think we need to be thinking about these things in as holistic way as possible. That's why I stress the need for partnership to try to avoid that. And I think it was a very important point made earlier about the sort of circular economy of arms and how one thinks about what happens to them if you don't use them, what is your broader industrial strategy, and like your longer term approach. So I think it is a worry, but that's why we need holistic approaches to policy making and longer term horizon scanning on what might happen.
Thank you. Rebecca, 30 seconds.
Yes, it's worry. Yes, the multilateral rules-based order has been tossed away by our greatest ally as not being appropriate to us and not being appropriate to them. And yes, Europe has had to react very, very sharply to that and has done so to its credit with speed, because Europe does have a problem. Europe has a problem that it has been over-reliant on America for a very long period of time. It believed that the rest of the world would want European values of multilateralism and trust and all these types of things. It's created massive discontent amongst the BRICS nations. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about our own economic and defense and security.
André,
I
final
say
words?
yes is the very short answer, and I agree that I think the times of cheap Russian gas, cheap Chinese consumer goods, and cheap American security is over for generations. So there is a balancing act that is needed, but overall, yes, it is a worry. More weapons might mean more trouble.
Well, thank you so much of this. A little bit of gloomy way to finish, but very realistic, and that's what this event was about, to take a good look and drill down on those issues that have been bubbling at the surface for a while. Thank you so much for everybody, Rebecca, Andre, and Dora, and thank you for people in London and online, and for those here, please join us for a drink in the ante room. Thank you so much.